already? Welcome everyone to the first event in the series Black Lives Matter at Utrecht University, Creating Change. My name is Nina Köll.
Hello, welcome. I want to present Nina, who is a teacher and scholar in Media and Cultural Studies and a fellow of the Media Studies track at the University College Utrecht. She's also the chair of the recently formed Diversity Committee, a bottom-up initiative by her and her colleagues Agnes Andever and Marca Valenta at this college.
Oh yeah, and I'm here with Rolando Vázquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Utrecht University. And Rolando is the co-founder and co-director of the Decolonial Summer School at Summer School Utrecht, together with Walter Mignolo, which is now in its 11th year, if I'm not mistaken. Rolando also co-authored the much discussed Let's Do Diversity report at the University of Amsterdam, together with Professor Gloria Wecker.
Thank you, Nina. Well, this event is the first event in the Black Lives Matter at UU, University of Utrecht, Creating Change series. It is an initiative of the new Diversity Dean at the University of Utrecht, Janneke Plattenga, and the University of Utrecht Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Program. The event is organized by UCU, the Liberal Arts and Science College at Utrecht. I want to say, to start the event and to start the series, that the objectives of academic excellence and global justice of the university cannot be achieved without diversity. But diversity is not simply a normative statement, but a doing. It is, in a way, a verb. It is not enough to declare equality and inclusion. Actually, we know that egalitarianism and discourses on tolerance have been often complicit with systems of inequality and intolerance. Equality needs to be practiced, inclusion needs to be practiced. Diversity is essential for academic excellence and to sustain just and open societies.
Thanks. Thanks, Rolando.
Thank you.
Now a bit about this particular event. As Rolando just said, it's the first in a series of events on Black Lives Matter in response and in conversation with Black Lives Matter and the anti-racism movement. We will start off with Mr. Gary Younge, who will spark our thinking with his keynote on why Black Lives Matter in Europe and why they've always mattered in Europe, despite having been repressed, erased in Europe's official histories and public memory. Most of you probably know Gary Younge as a journalist and as a commentator for The Guardian, where he was the editor-at-large until this year, when he left his job as a journalist after 27 years for an academic post at the sociology department at Manchester University. He has also been a visiting professor at London South Bank University, and he taught public policy at Brooklyn College in New York. Gary Younge has so many honorary doctorates and fellowships that it would take a little too long to name them here, but you can find them all on his webpage, which I advise you to look up. Also, his books, and he's written quite a few, have received much acclaim. The last book, Another Day in the Death of America, won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize from Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation. And I heard through the grapevine that this last book might be adapted into a movie. We'll see. Younge's keynote will serve as the starting point for a broader conversation about how Black Lives Matter and how the movement can help us reimagine our institutions, including universities. And we're going to do so in a panel with Caribbean Dutch visual and performance artist, writer, anti-racism activist, and alumnus of this university, Quinsy Gario. And his most well-known work, Black Pete is Racism, critiqued the general knowledge surrounding the racist Dutch figure and practice of Zwarte Piet, Black Piet. And with this project, Gario also received international attention. In fact, much of his work focuses on Dutch colonial archive and on decolonial remembering, so a topic that will reverberate in Younge's keynote, I believe. In the final segment of this event, we will also have some time for questions from the audience, from the highly limited audience in this room, limited because of COVID, of course, COVID protocol, and the sheer unlimited audience online for those who are watching the live stream. And we'd like to encourage our online viewers to use the YouTube chat function for questions. We have two experts who will help select pertinent questions from the chat and read them out loud to us. Let me introduce to you. On the right, Candice Etemisi, who is a student here at University College Utrecht and a member of the recently formed POC, People of Color Student Group. And to the left, Ella Shields from the Black Lives Alumni Group here at University College Utrecht. But now, without further ado, please give a warm round of applause to Mr. Gary Younge.
Thank you, Nina, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, University of Utrecht, for inviting me. It's, I always think that they should call social distancing physical distancing. I think we have to be as social as we can be, even as we are physically distant. And so it's been a real joy to have had this chance to come to Holland, because none of us, including myself, have been traveling an awful lot recently, and to get outside of your bubble and to engage actually in many ways feels more precious than ever. So thank you very much. I want to start with a tale from the summer of 1944. As the Nazi occupation of Paris was reduced to a few desperate crackles of gunfire, the Allies prepared for the optics of liberation. General de Gaulle planned to walk in triumph down the Champs-Élysées, the returning conqueror, as though it were he who had ousted Hitler both from the capital and the country, and not primarily the British and the Americans and the resistance. But there was a problem. 2/3 of the Free French forces which he commanded comprised colonial troops, overwhelmingly from Africa. And if this were truly going to be a victory for civilization over barbarism, then the visuals for the Allied powers were all wrong. America still exercised strict segregation over its military personnel. Britain did not, but still had a rigid caste system of empire to protect. And so the sight of black troops identified with liberating a European nation was more than the Americans could bear. In a memo referring to the division that would accompany de Gaulle on liberation, stamped confidential, in January 1944, Dwight Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, wrote, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel." He continued, "This would indicate the 2nd Armored Division, which is with only 1/4 native personnel." For native, read black. for this is the only French division operationally available that could be made 100% white. The British agreed. It is unfortunate that the only French formation that is 100% white is an armoured division in Morocco, wrote the British General Frederick Morgan in a document to Allied Supreme Command. Every other French division is only about 40% white. And I've told Colonel de Chavannes that his chances of getting what he wants will be vastly improved if he can provide a white infantry division. Now, even with these manipulations, it was not possible to find an all-white division. There were just too many black people who had been prepared to lay down their lives to make liberation happen. So Allied Command insisted that all black soldiers be taken out and replaced by white ones from other units, and when even that didn't suffice, they filled the gaps with soldiers from parts of North Africa and the Middle East who might be mistaken for white instead. But there was one guy that didn't get a memo, or maybe he did get a memo and he didn't like it. And his name was George Duckson. He was from Gabon, and he was 22. His dad had fought for the French in the First World War, and he had signed up for the Second. He was caught by the Germans and put in a prisoner of war camp in 1940, but escaped in 1943 and joined the resistance and made his way to Paris. And in the week preceding the German surrender, he fought tenaciously in the street-to-street combat, earning himself the nickname, the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. It was in the run-up to de Gaulle's victory, he had a bet with his friends that he could get into the papers on the parade himself. And so there he is, photobombing de Gaulle, appearing just in shot, sometimes over de Gaulle's shoulder, as the French leader's bodyguards desperately try to shove him out of the camera's eye and beyond the gaze of history. Duckson's eventful trip down the Champs-Élysées that day stands, I think, as a partial metaphor for the black experience in Europe. Central to its endeavors, economically, politically, militarily, Europe does not make sense without black people. The Industrial Revolution could not have been financed without us. The world wars could not have been fought without us. The rebuilding of the continent of Europe after the Second World War would not have been possible without us. We are woven into the history of this continent so tightly that if you were to try and unpick us from it, the entire thing would start to unravel. Winston Churchill once said, "This small island," referring to Britain, "is dependent for our daily bread on our trade and imperial connections. Cut this away, and at least a third of our population must vanish speedily from the face of the earth." Europe's wealth was built on our backs with our sweat. Its status and power was contingent on our captivity. Our amputation from its history is willful. Its delusions are deliberate. And whenever we show up to photobomb the parade, to insist on our inclusion in times of triumph, as we were included in times of toil, to correct the record and claim our rightful place, not on the margins, but at the center, there is always someone trying to push us off, to deny our rightful place, and to keep us out of the shot. What we saw this summer was rare and in some ways extraordinary. For in Europe, we are used to acts of solidarity with Black America, almost wearily so. From the vantage point of a continent that both resents and covets American power, but is in no position to do anything about either, African Americans often represent to many white Europeans a redemptive force. The living proof that the US is both not all that it claims to be and could be so much greater than it is. The French hugged African-American artists and writers like James Baldwin, Sidney Bechet, and Richard Wright close. The Free Angela Davis campaign received more mail from East Germany than they could ever open. Paul Robeson found a home and an audience in England and Wales and elsewhere on the continent when he was hounded in America. Europe has, to some extent, a sterling record of exporting anti-racism. But what we saw this summer was not merely an expression of solidarity with what happened there, it was an interpretation of what happened there into the reality of what is happening here. From the demonstrations and the rebellions that bloomed in the US, there was a pollination. The seeds landed in different places across the continent, only to find their home and fertile soil, and then their target wherever they rested. A conversation that began in Minneapolis found resonance from Malmo to Manchester. A combination of black Europeans and their anti-racist allies simply refused to be pushed out of the shot, or to entertain this as an American problem with which we sympathize. Instead, they translated it into the domestic issues where they were that must be prioritized. This pollination found King Leopold in Antwerp and elsewhere. It found the slave trader Edward Colson in Britain. In Paris, it blended with the names of George Floyd with Adama Traore. In Lisbon, they reportedly saw their biggest anti-racist demonstration ever. And this translation is important. America is not Europe. We know that. Its culture is more lethal in a range of ways. They execute people. Every day now, 9 kids are shot dead. So of course its racism is more violent. There are some people who say America is our future, and I sincerely hope that that's not the case. True, they had the first minority black president. It's also true that a black man in Washington, D.C. has a lower life expectancy than a man on the Gaza Strip. Black America also has institutions, both civil and religious, that have existed for well over a century and that have the capacity to sustain social movements in a way that we, in the black communities in Europe, do not. For all that, there is, of course, considerable overlap. We are more likely here to be stopped, searched, arrested, charged, incarcerated, and get longer sentences than white people. Put bluntly, our criminal system is unfair and racially biased against us here in Europe as it is in America. We are also more likely to be poor, excluded, underpaid, and underrepresented as they are too in America. We too, as in America, are likely to be misrepresented in the media and political classes. So there are parallels, but the differences are also key. 19th century French intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville once wrote, "No African came in freedom to the shores of the New World. The Negro transmits to his descendants at birth the external mark of his ignominy. The law can abolish servitude, but only God can obliterate its traces." But what de Tocqueville neglected to make clear is that it was primarily the old world that brought them there. Europe has every bit as vile a history of racism as the Americas. Indeed, the histories are entwined and endure. One of the central distinctions, though, between the racial histories of Europe and the US is that until relatively recently, the European repression and resistance took place primarily abroad. Our civil rights movement was in Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, Congo, and elsewhere. And in the post-colonial era, this offshoring of responsibility has left significant room for denial, distortion, ignorance, and sophistry when it comes to understanding that history. In the post-colonial era, this has left significant room for all kinds of manipulations. "It's quite true," wrote George Orwell in England, Your England, "that the English are hypocritical about their empire. In the working class, this hypocrisy takes the form of not knowing that the empire exists." In 1951, 10 years after that essay was published, the UK government social survey revealed that 59% of British people could not name a single colony. This selective amnesia around race leads ineluctably to a deeply flawed sense of superiority around racism among white Europeans with regard to the US that stems from a woefully incomplete and toxically nostalgic misunderstanding of their own history. 1 in 2 of the Dutch, 1 in 3 of the Britons, and 1 in 4 of the French and Belgians, 1 in 5 Italians believe their country's former empire is something to be proud of, according to recent polls. Conversely, only 1 in 20 Dutch, 1 in 7 French, 1 in 5 Brits, and 1 in 4 Belgians and Italians think that the empire was something to be ashamed of. These are all nations where we saw demonstrations in solidarity with the rebellions in America. And sometimes the indignation that white Europeans exhibit all too often bears insufficient self-awareness to see what most of the rest of the world has seen. They wonder in all sincerity how America could have arrived at such a brutal place with either no recognition or no regrets that they have traveled that path themselves. The standard of racial conversation, even among those white Europeans who consider themselves enlightened and sympathetic, cultured and informed, is woefully low. So we witness an explosion, as we did during the summer. The media and political classes discover the reality of race much in the same way that teenagers discover sex. Urgently, earnestly, voraciously, and carelessly, with great self-indulgence, but precious little self-awareness. The knowledge that it's out there collides with the urgent desire to find out where. Like hormonal adolescents, they talk about it endlessly and carelessly, unsure of what to say or think. They have a lot of questions, but even if they did know whom to ask, they would be too crippled by embarrassment to reveal their ignorance. Everyone has an opinion, but only few have any experience. The interest never goes away, though its intensity wanes as they explore other things. The trouble is that if you are black and European, then the reality does not go away for us because we are still here. So to insist on the notion of the Black Lives Matter in Europe is not only to insist on our own humanity and equality, both in law and in life, but on a full and honest accounting of European history. For if we do not understand how we got here, not simply geographically, but politically, economically, culturally, philosophically, then of course we will struggle to figure out where we are. And this is not just a problem for black people. It's a problem for everyone. The late, great British Sri Lankan activist and intellectual Ambalavana Sivanandan used to say of us as post-colonial migrants, well, we are here because you were there. But then, of course, how would you understand that if you never knew where you were? People in England will say, often, we won the war, even if they didn't fight and were not even born. They will say, we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play and were not born. But when you ask them about colonialism and the slave trade, they say, but that wasn't me. I wasn't there. I wasn't born. Power has many parents, but the brutality it takes to acquire it is generally an orphan. So what we saw this summer, after a decade or more of full-scale degradation in our national conversations around race, nation, identity, and culture, was a brief, sharp reckoning. It's not that they just realized that Zwarte Piet was racist. We just made it more uncomfortable for some to deny it than to admit it. They didn't just realize that Cecil Rhodes was a colonial bigot. It just became more embarrassing to keep him up there than it was to take him down. They didn't just discover King Leopold's human rights abuses. It was just less demeaning to take it down than to keep it up. This summer, we caught a brief, heady scent of our potential as Black Europeans, as a diaspora, and as progressives. Emboldened and engaged, we took the fight to them. We have a long way to go, and our victories were primarily symbolic. But while it's important that symbols should not be mistaken for substance, they should not be dismissed as insubstantial either. Europe has been put on notice. Like George Duckson on the Champs-Élysées, we are determined to take our rightful place. We are coming for your statues and your textbooks, your parliaments and your boardrooms. There are no guarantees that we will win, but there is a certainty that if we don't keep on fighting, that we will lose. And so, in the spirit of bonhomie that owes more to the Black Atlantic than the transatlantic, I finish with the words of the great African-American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men and women who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Thank you.
Thank you. Quincy, do you want to join us on stage, please? And give a warm applause also for Quincy Gario. Gary, we're going to give you a minute so you can take a moment of rest. I'm going to start with you, Quincy. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Quincy, when Gary spoke the lines, and whenever we show up to photobomb the parade, to insist on our inclusion, to correct the record and claim our rightful place, not on the margins, but at the center, there's always someone trying to push us off. I couldn't help but think of you and some of the work you've been doing as an artist and anti-racism activist, inserting yourself into the Dutch Cultural Archive and its institutions, for example, with your Black Pete is Racism artwork. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your work that focuses on decolonial remembering, and tell us how or in how far it correlates with Gary's perspective on colonial amnesia?
I mean, thank you for having me. Thank you for the wonderful talk. And I mean, if you don't keep on fighting, we will lose. Yes. And I can't start to answer that question without giving a big shout out to Professor Gloria Wekker. I think maybe she's watching, because I sent her an app. And I have to thank, I mean, the Theater, Film, and Television Studies department, where I studied here as well, where I got, in a sense, radicalized, if you can still use that term, by going to Professor Wekker's classes here at this very university. So it's important for me to say that and to give her the credits for the work that she does. And to then also connect that to all the other teachers I've had in that sense. And I think one of the teachers I had was the late Alana Lockwood, who organized the Black Euro Body Politics Conference, and who was pushing for these types of conversations in which we look at Europe, Black presence in Europe, and the ways in which we can, through decolonial thinking, attempt to disrupt that.
And when was that?
So
how
that
can-
was, so the funny thing is, I started with the T-shirt project, Short to Peter's Racism, in June of 2011. And on the 1st of July 2011, she walked past as we were in Oster Park during the commemoration of the abolition of slavery, together with Teresa Maria Diaz-Nerio. And Teresa was like, hey, you need to talk to Quinsy. She was telling that to Alana. And Alana gave me her card and she was like, I'm organizing something next year. Would you want to come? We hadn't even spoken properly yet. She saw the shirt and she was like, okay, and we need to have something there. And then there is where I came into like an amazing community of thinkers, academics, artists, speakers. Rolando, Walter, Jeanette, it's been amazing in that sense to think of these places as moments of not trying to fit into a canon, a Western canon, Western European canon, but thinking of seeing that canon as an option. Right? And to delink from the idea that that's the only canon or that's the only universal canon of thought or universal canon of aesthetics, of thinking. And so my work has always been seen as in opposition to and to be included in. And actually it's not. It's more about the recentering of. And I think one of the things that came forward, especially in the argument at the beginning with the George Duckson example, it's not about putting him into the picture, it's understanding that picture with him in the center. It's a completely recentering of not just the optics, not just the conversation, but of thinking of what it meant for someone from Gabon to be there at the liberation of Paris and to insist on his presence being remembered and how we remember that. And I think that's a lot of the work that is within the wonderful lecture we just heard, but also in the work that people like Professor Wecker do, and like you do in your own work. It's also about this sense of not wanting to adhere to the paradigms which tell us that some of us aren't human, but changing that whole focus and changing that whole conversation.
Thank you. So just a follow-up question. Some of these conversations took place inside academia as well, and some of them took place outside of academia. So there were all these pockets of spaces already 10 years ago within academia where we could have these conversations.
Definitely.
Right?
I mean, the 1st of June, I wore the T-shirt at Café de Bastard here in Utrecht at a poetry slam. The 2nd of June and the 3rd of June, I was at the UvA for a conference called Technologies of Belonging. And there is where I met Belle Parnell-Berry. There is where I met Devorah Yanow. And Belle is the person who actually took the first picture of the T-shirt and put it on Facebook and was like, hey, if you want one, go to Quinsy. And she actually wrote, "The revolution has started." I'm like, wow, it's like prophetic in a certain sense.
So this has all been going on, right, for a long time. We're not just starting the conversation. This reminds me of an epigraph to your book, Another Day in the Death of America, where you quote the Swedish literary historian Sven Lindqvist, who wrote, "You already know enough, so do I. It's not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and draw conclusions." So could you maybe, and you've made this point yourself in numerous articles and interviews, namely that there is a bit of a disconnect or discrepancy between the wealth of knowledge and the lack of courage to draw conclusions from this knowledge. Could you elaborate and what you mean by that? And do you also think, follow up, has this changed in this year?
Yeah, I mean, there's Chomsky has a great quote. Somebody talks to him about talking truth to power, and he says, power already knows the truth. The issue isn't that power doesn't know the truth, it's that it actually would rather that we all lived a lie. And I kind of alluded to it in the talk, that kind of an awful lot of what we've seen the kind of, Mark Rutte evolving over, Zwarte Piet or, okay, we'll take the Cecil Rhodes statue down. It's not that they didn't know, it's that they didn't really care, and they didn't have to care. And so the reason, there's two reasons why that's important, I think. The first is that we have had this summer where certainly in English language books, both in America and Britain, there's been this skyrocketing of certain works of literature, which is not fiction, non-fiction. Some fiction too, but René Edo-Lodge, Michel Alexander, Robin DiAngelo, a lot of them kind of how-to books, actually, for kind of white people about how to not be racist and so on. But there was this desire, which I understand because it was a pandemic and so there was a limit to what people could do, but to kind of read our way out. And I feel, well, we didn't read our way into this. This wasn't the product of stupid people. And there has been, this notion that racism is the preserve of the ignorant and the boorish. Actually, it's a racket. It's a very big racket, and white people do really badly out of it too, actually, a significant proportion of them. And that somehow we have to decouple the notion of racism and a lack of intelligence, a lack of knowledge, because that's not what it's about. It's very knowing. The second thing is really that kind of is about what we become accustomed to. And so what we know but we don't see. And the example I want to give here is of the journalistic adage, with all due apologies to half the human race, where they say, when a dog bites a man, that's not a story. When a man bites a dog, that's a story. And this is when I did my book on all the kids that got shot dead in one day, and I would ask a reporter, did you go down there and talk? And it'd be like, it's not so surprising that people would die down there. This is not so surprising, that this is not news. And so we're in this moment where it's actually not that more African Americans are being shot dead by the police, it's that we're now paying attention. It's not that Colston, Zwarte Piet, Cecil Rhodes, Leopold, it's not new. We knew. And so you have to kind of upend that adage and say, who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? And what can we do to control these dogs? So why have we become inured to what is obscene? Why have we become almost anesthetized to what is wrong and disgusting? And in Europe's case, and this is why I think the story of the Americans and the Brits kind of choreographing, how did we come by this forgetfulness? How did we learn not to see what we did, or to see what we did and somehow forget it? How did we put the great in Great Britain, actually? How was it that this small island became a member of the Security Council? How did that happen? So for those two reasons, I think it's kind of sometimes really just important to say, well, we know this, don't we? So it's an interesting thing that used to happen, particularly after 9/11 in Britain, where they would say, what we need is an open and honest conversation about race, as though progressives and anti-racists were stopping this honesty, that everybody was treading on eggshells, which they weren't. And you thought, well, who's stopping you having this conversation? Nobody. But what we don't do is having an open and honest conversation about how Europe got to be the way it is, how black people got to be in Europe, and what we do in Europe. And that became really clear during the pandemic, when, first of all, you got a sense of who was dying disproportionately, and secondly, you got a sense of who were the key workers, Who's keeping this place going? When everybody else is told to stay home, who has to keep going to work? And black people, people of color, were disproportionately, and migrants were disproportionately among the people that it turned out that we couldn't survive without. From Deliveroo all the way to nurses and doctors and sanitation workers and all of that. So it's all not all of it, but a significant amount of the things that we need to kind of excavate and disperse is hiding in plain sight. It's right out there, and yet it goes fully unacknowledged.
Quinsy, I saw you were taking notes. You were writing down some notes. Do you want to respond to that?
Well,
Or add to that?
Not necessarily respond. I mean, it's a conversation to add. In the sense of the forgetfulness, it's an engineered forgetfulness. I don't think the work that Professor Wecker has done with her book White Innocence. Yeah, I was going to say Dutch Innocence, but sorry. Is specifically looking at those mechanisms of forgetting and thinking through how to disrupt those, or how to think beyond the mechanisms in which we are taught to remember. And I think one of the interesting things for me as well is this notion of the intelligence and racism. It keeps being used as if the technocratic, bureaucratic-sounding policies that are put in place aren't extremely intelligently thought out, not to seem racist, while they are. I mean, Mark Rutte, our Prime Minister, was convicted for racism as Undersecretary. He set up a program in which the police and social services could hunt Somali Dutch to find out if they were defrauding the state or not. Recently, we had a whole crisis because mothers and people who were getting toeslag, child benefits, that they were being hunted, and through algorithms were telling them that they were defrauding and they had to pay everything back. One lady even committed suicide because of this. So, and it's an intelligent system that's been put in place based on the foundations that we already have, but seemingly, presented as neutral algorithm stuff. It's like, no, this is the future of what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah?
Well, and someone did a kind of more lyrical riff on this, so I don't want to kind of look like I'm plagiarizing, but that if white people were dying in the proportions that they were, that we are dying in COVID, or if they were incarcerated at the rates that we were, it would be understood as a scandal if they were being criminalized or excluded from school or failed. And so there is a kind of, it's both an obvious question, but one to which there is an answer. How comes this isn't a scandal? And actually, what intrigues me about that is that all of this stuff takes place in this moment of enormous fragility when it comes to white people, and particularly discussions around class. So whenever you mention anything about race, I mean, you say, well, there's lots of poor white people, why don't you talk about them? And first of all, we do quite often. Secondly, to talk about one person isn't to necessarily ignore another person. Can we just, let's eat our lunch and then we can have dessert? It's possible to do both in the same sitting. But there is this kind of, this way in which, that certain people don't count. In some ways, they are overcounted, they are targeted, they are kind of, they are zeroed in on. When it comes to refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, they count obsessively, literally, and then and then there's the way in which we kind of don't count at all, in which we don't kind of matter, or that the disproportionate ways in which we are oppressed are somehow kind of can fade into the distance. There's this very selective arithmetic that takes place about who we are, which leads to really, really weird distortion. So kind of, I'm going to fluff these numbers, but it's bizarre how many more Muslims people think there are in Britain and France and Holland and Italy than there are. How many more migrants? And you think, well, yeah, if you think there are 7 times more migrants than there are, you might be afraid of migrants. If I thought that a kitten was 7 times bigger than a kitten is, I'd be afraid of kittens. So kind of, you know, the distorted way in which people kind of, and it's not an accident. That's basically what we're saying. None of this is an accident.
But sort of relates also what you said about this engineered forgetfulness, is engineered exclusion mechanism, discrimination. So I wonder, I mean, it's engineered erasure in history, as we heard in your keynote. But something happened in 2020, right? Is this correct to say? Has the conversation changed, proliferated? Do we now have the courage to face that erasure, to face that engineered racism? Do you see generational differences as well?
I mean, we've always had the courage. There've always
Maybe
been...
we need to delineate what we mean by we.
Yeah.
I think, you know.
Yeah. No, but I mean, there have always been people who have been fighting against it in their own different ways. We were just talking about it in the cab ride over here. I mean, from Claudia Jones setting up a parade in 1959 to protest against the murder of a black man. That's a way of pushing against it. Frank Boeien, who wrote the song Zwart en Wit, after the murder of Kerwin Dijkmeyer, right? That's also a way of pushing back.
But has it magnified? Has that we that's fighting become broader? Would you say, or is that taking it too far?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that it's not a magnifying. I think a lot more people have stopped buying into white superiority. I think a lot of people have realized that white superiority or white domination or the endeavor to dominate is violent towards the one who wants to dominate as well. So you see there's a mentality shift by a lot of people who realize, like, wait, what's happening here is not exactly what should be happening. Because as well, this idea of being afraid of being in the minority, it's based on knowing what you as a majority do to the minority, right? So you're only afraid of becoming minoritized because you as a majoritized group are always violent towards the minoritized group. So that's that whole mentality that's now being broken down. I think that's a really interesting thing. And also in terms of thinking about like arithmetic, I just have to think about the fact that in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, there was arithmetic used to count my ancestors, right? So we've always been, in that sense, our worth has been disconnected from the way how we've been seen and categorized and put into function, right? What's our function in society? All these types of questions have always been there. And now you're seeing a pull away, and we have the knowledge and we have the resistance to that.
I mean, I think that, first of all, without being snide about your question, 2020 is still going, and I think it's an open question, you know, where that's why I kind of think of it as a pollination. I think of these things that fly, you know, they fly around, a dandelion or a daisy or whatever, and they don't all land at the same time and in the same place. We don't quite we don't exactly know. But I think that we can't understand this year abstracted from other years. And so we have had this period of the normalization of fascism as a mainstream ideology in Europe, once again, and the kind of, what I was referring to as a degradation in our kind of national conversations. Brexit being a very good example in Britain, but elsewhere, a kind of a really ugly and I would say pathetic, if it wasn't also lethal in terms of people dying in the Mediterranean and so on, attempt to kind of redefine who we are and how we got here. That has been going on for a long time without an awful lot of pushback in the kind of, neoliberal consensus that we had, which was killing us, some of us. And so this moment was a kind of, there was an emboldening of some people who were latent, who saw, who didn't like, but kind of didn't know what to do or where to go necessarily, and some people who were active and who were kind of, had been sometimes in very lonely circumstances, in very isolated circumstances, kind of carrying this torch and hoping that it wouldn't blow out. And that in a very kind of spontaneous way, I find it quite intriguing, given the number of black people who are killed by the American police, kind of the precise alchemy of what makes one flare up in a way that it does and others not. But there was a kind of, the spontaneous nature of these outpourings and in some places rebellions suggest that there was a constituency waiting to be rallied, and that I do think people are emboldened, and I think that will make a difference. I do think that all sorts of institutions, including this one, made statements which they will then be held to, and an awful lot of the work that's going to come out of this moment in that kind of pollinating image, you won't see it all. Do you know what I mean? It won't be kind of clear to that. It will take place in school governors meetings and in committees, like your committee will take, there will be, but I do think people are emboldened, and I think that, and of course there is also a backlash which started even before the lash had finished, and so it's an open question where it will end up, but I think wherever it ends up, we are not now going to go back to where we were. I think there are things that cannot be unknown. They can be hidden, distorted, manipulated, but they can't be unknown. And there was a significant raising of awareness, and a constituency has been actually kind of created. It was latent, and now it has been shown that it's possible for it to be active. But to what end, and the degree to which we are capable of converting the symbolic into the substantial. If you went around and asked most black people in Britain or Belgium, what's the main thing that you want settled in your life, they wouldn't say statues. But that doesn't mean that that's a bad place to start in terms of the things that they would say take a long time.
Why is that not a bad place to start?
Because because in a kind of situationist way, in a kind of graphic way, it kind of it was it provided a reckoning with an insult. That this statue of Edward Colson was an insult, and it forced a conversation about who we are and how we got here, and it was an act of history itself, actually, And left there, of course, I think it's insufficient. But similarly, I think if you ask most black Dutch people, what's the most pressing thing? What do you want to happen? What is that? They probably wouldn't say Zwarte Piet. But when you address Zwarte Piet, you're not just talking about that one symbol. That symbol and its celebration for those who celebrate it, just like the veneration that comes with the statue, reflects other things. And so in Britain, what we had, it was kind of funny in a way. After the Colston statue came down, and a few other statues that actual local councils just kind of took down. And the thing about statues is that when you put people up there, people usually forget. So it's not like white people are walking around thinking, I love all these statues around me. It's just a piece of kind of architecture, it's a piece of,
Urban
street furniture.
Yeah, street furniture.
And, but you had the site in central London of neo-Nazis protecting Churchill. Now, there's a lot going on there. So they too understood, if not the history, then at least the kind of power of the symbolism.
Yeah.
I would like to move the conversation more towards institutional change and also universities. In one of our previous conversations, Quinsy, you said something about differentiating two domains of memory. On the one hand, institutional memory, and on the other, community memory. And could you explain what you mean by community memory? And as a follow-up, how can community memory inform institutions, such as universities, in a productive way, in a meaningful way? And in how far is this even desirable, given the current modus operandi of, for example, academic institutions?
Well, I mean, institutions have a certain way of remembering their own actions, remembering the people who are part of the institution, and remembering what type of effect the institution has had on its surroundings or on what it's doing, right? And then you have the people who are either taking part in these events, who are going through the institution, who are doing things. Maybe a personal anecdote then. So a while back, there was a former teacher from the university who on Twitter was writing about a moment in which they were giving a course on narratology, how narratives work. And there was a student who had gotten in a bit of a tiff with one of the teachers, and the student had made, according to this teacher, an argument in which the narrative of Zwarte Piet was pulled apart to expose how it was racist. Now the teacher then refused to accept it and was grading the student, below the grade. Then the student went to this teacher who was talking about on Twitter and was like, okay, what should I do? And then the teacher was like, yeah, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can take my course, or you can do something else. And then the guy on Twitter, the teacher on Twitter said like, no, it can, the student then told him like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to stick it out and I'll work around it, figure out a way. And at the end of the clue, at the end of the Twitter thread, he said it was me. And I had completely forgotten about this instance. Oh. So I was like, oh, okay, this was fascinating. To then have this sense of community memory in that sense, what type of impact that had on him. And for me, it was just like one of those racist teachers you brush off and you keep on going. Yeah. So there you see in which way certain types of things, and I said racist teacher, maybe I should put it a different way, a teacher who was acting in a way that was racist, before I get myself in trouble. And what was interesting about that is that these types of anecdotes talk about the ways in which our personal stories sometimes carry more information than we even remember. or that we even give value to in a certain sense. And in that way, you find there's a lot of history hidden in photo albums, hidden in anecdotes that parents tell to their kids or aunts and uncles say at family barbecues, and you hear something, you're like, whoa, what is that? What was that about? And so the thing for me is you need both, in a sense.
Community memory and institutional memory.
Because the institutional memory gets protected in a sense, and you need a community memory to constantly disrupt the institutional memory. So you need to not just want to become part of it, but you need to agitate against it. Because the hegemonic forces, so the dominant forces of the institution, will always try to protect itself. So how do you make sure that those who always fall outside of the institution also make sure that they're being protected? And that's a constant struggle.
But you previously also talked about an unproductive way of using community memory. And I specifically remember, you made the point that it's important not just to talk about, write about research on communities, but to also, maybe you want to finish?
Well, I mean, my uncle, for example, he studied in Utrecht in the late 70s, mid 80s. And he was filming with his Super 8 camera. And last summer I was in Curacao and he gave me this bag with Super 8 film. And I was going through it, I got it scanned. And I'm looking at some images of my cousins when they were born and growing up. I'm looking at Christmas, I'm looking at him going on trips. And then I see this footage of Carnival. And it's Carnival here in Utrecht. 1983, and I'm like, what? I'm like, there was a carnival here? And so usually what happens when artists encounter these types of amazing finds, they start to talk about and over, and they become, in a certain sense, a bit violent towards the source of this information. So what I've been doing with my uncle is, whenever I am invited to do something, he's in the package. So he's there with me via Zoom or whatever technology we use, and he's on stage talking about what it was for him as a Black Curacao student in Utrecht.
So you're giving him an opportunity to have a voice?
I'm not giving him anything. I'm making sure that he's not forgotten.
Okay.
I'm making sure that the claims that we make based on the information that we have also include the people who are part of those claims. So if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and if we're talking about making sure that we stop the violence against Black people, then that means that we have to stop doing that as well in the practices that we have. That means that it's not just a question of seeing something, extracting it, and then using it. It's being accountable and responsible.
Yeah. 2 days ago at the Read My World Festival, I was interviewed by Aldith Honka and about my favorite books, or the books that had the most impact on me, which is not quite the same, weirdly. But one of them was a collection of talks by E.H. Carr called What is History? And one of the things that really struck me in that essay, which I read when I was, the first one is called The Facts of History. I must have read it when I was about 19 or 20. And he uses the example of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, which was what would trigger a military response. And he says, look, Caesar crossed many streams, and many people crossed the Rubicon. What makes Caesar crossing the Rubicon a fact of history? Like, you actually have to make that case. And that's how I feel about our stories, that we have an awful lot of stories that aren't recorded because it's been decided that they're not kind of Caesar crossing Rubicon stories, but they can be if we say they are. And if you look at the way that rich people and posh people's stories are covered, Harry and Meghan say, we all know when they get married, we all know about their trials and tribulations, we all know well, why is that a story? And why is my parents' marriage not a story, for example? And once you get into that, I think you get into the kind of weeds of our histories, which are often way more interesting, dynamic, differently gendered, more working class than we give credit for. So a really good example, I think, is the story of the Montgomery bus boycott in America in 1954, which we know, if we know it at all, then it's Rosa Parks. She's very tired. She gets on the bus. She doesn't want to stand up. She's kind of frail lady. And so she just says, no, I'm not going to do it. And then the bus driver threatens to kick her off the bus. She says, go on, and so on. And this story, I remember because I was in the States working for The Guardian, you know, Bill Clinton's, it shows the power when Rosa Parks died of what one woman can do. And what's lost from that story, I mean, there's many things that are lost from that story, but first of all, a 15-year-old girl was kicked off the bus before Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin. She was dark, she got pregnant, she wasn't married. They were starting to go with her when she got pregnant, and then they dropped her like a hot potato. I found her, and I wrote her story, and she showed me the pictures from all over, of the letters from all over America, people saying, you know, we're with you. And then the local civil rights hierarchy, black, male, was like, no, we're not doing that. And so they drop her and they wait for the right person. Rosa Parks was a menace. She'd been kicked off loads of buses before. She was an active political agitator who never believed in nonviolence. She said, I could never get there. I was much more of a Malcolm X person than a Martin Luther King person. She wasn't just kind of some random lady that, this was the time when she got kicked off the bus and booked. But like, you know, she was known in the bus company for doing this. And then the whole story misses out the fact that there was a 13-month bus boycott where ordinary working people walked to work for 13 months so that this could end. But it's reduced to one person, she's old, but if you tell that other story, which I'm sure within that other story, there are loads of other stories that are lost as well. And, you know, I didn't get into the fact that it was the women who organized the bloody bus boycott. The preachers and so on were just the kind of figureheads. Then you start to think, oh, I could make history. I have a history. All the teenage mothers out there start thinking, oh, right, I can be part of something huge. All the kind of poor people and the kind of the people who would have to do the war. So, okay, so this is how history is made. So it has a really serious effect on now. So when when these stories are forgotten or distorted or lost, it's not just that we lose a part of ourselves in a corny way. It's not just that we lose that story. Our capacity to imagine ourselves being part of something worth remembering is diminished. And that is actually very, very important. So this is Black History Month in Britain. And a couple of times with my kids' schools, I've been asked, what do you think we should do? And they swing for the bleachers. Quite often it's American history, Martin Luther King stuff and all of that, or the trumpeter in 16th century kind of. But I say to them, I live in Hackney. We elected the first black woman to Parliament. I'm sure one of these kids, mothers or grandmothers more likely, was involved in that campaign. why don't you get them to come and talk to the kids about being involved in a historic moment? And then get the local MP, Diane Abbott, the first black woman, to come and speak to you. And then you'll get a sense of your place in history. And so these stories, we run around sometimes kind of metaphorically zooming halfway around the world to find stories when they're right with us. And they're not, nobody has extracted them from us. We have just failed to recognize their value. And actually, if anything's been extracted from us, what has been extracted is our capacity to recognize the value of our own stories.
This reminds me of a quote by a Dutch philosopher and artist, Simone Sarloos, who wrote a book on commemoration, and she recently said, if we have a singular narration of the past, how can we have a pluralist future? So, which I think sort of ties in with what you just said about these singular narrations. They are not productive in a pluralist world, right? I think this is a good moment maybe to include some questions from the audience.
Can I also note that it's also Black Achievement Month here in the Netherlands,
Here, yes.
every October.
Yeah.
When is Black Failure Month?
It's a good
Or
question.
mediocre month.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very keen on our ability to fail, because so much hinges on our necessity to succeed, and actually, you can't succeed all the time, and it would be quite nice to celebrate our right to be mediocre, our right to actually fail, because otherwise we have to be bloody Usain Bolt or just stay at home, and not everybody can be Usain Bolt.
Right, or Beyonce for that matter.
Beyonce.
Shout out to Amal Al-Haq, who always says that.
Alright.
Curator, yeah.
So, Candice, do you want to start with a question? We're going to start with questions from the online audience, and then you have the opportunity as well.
Okay. I'm going to start with a question of my own. It's related to some of the questions. in the
Maybe
chat.
want to use the microphone.
I'm going to start with a question of my own. So Riz Ahmed, a British actor, he talks about the difference between diversity and representation, and how diversity is often used as a side piece, or like as something to create the idea that we are inclusive, but what we should be striving for is representation and having voices actually in the conversation when making change in institutions and organizations. How do you believe in this concept of between diversity and representation, and how do you think we could go from being diverse to being representative?
Yeah, I saw a thing the other day, an internet meme that said, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I feel that, first of all, I feel it's important to dwell on the meaning rather than the word, right? Because quite often we can get wrapped up in the word when we're actually kind of doing the same thing. And there is, and here I'm quoting, I interviewed Angela Davis, and she talked about diversity as possibly being the difference that makes no difference and the change that brings no change. But that diversity, when it involves, when it is as part of a notion of equality, that is a different thing. And so part of what we have to do is kind of be clear about what we mean while not getting hung up on the words, being clear about what we mean with the words that we are kind of using, if you see what I mean. And so, because diversity is important, difference is important, and it would be a really, I think, a really weird kind of ultra thing to kind of just claim that it's not, that it's kind of, that it doesn't mean anything. But it can also be manipulated in order so that you have photo opportunities rather than equal opportunities, so that things look different but act the same. And actually, I think that's the same thing with representation. that we have the most diverse cabinet in British history at the moment. So in terms of representation, we have the most diverse parliament in British history. We also have an awful lot of racism, and an awful lot of that racism is coming out of that parliament. So when it comes to representation, you do have to be careful what you wish for. Because if you say, for example, we need more black MPs, and the Conservatives are better at getting black MPs than the right, then you better want to talk about what they're doing. That I had this acutely in America with Obama, and the people would say, isn't it exciting that we're going to get a black president? And I say, well, not if it's Condoleezza Rice, no. Not if it's, do you know what I mean? There's lots of people, lots of black people, I would not want to be president. There are lots of black presidents around the world who are really awful. So, no, not necessarily. But if you're talking about Obama, then maybe. But it depends what he does. And it's telling that Black Lives Matter grew under Obama, and almost without any real reference to him. He became the picture in the bodega and the barbershop. It wasn't, people weren't looking to him to kind of do anything. And so, once again, actually representation is important. It's important that, you know, we have power structures that look like us and that we have representatives that look like us. But once again, it depends on what they do. And so, if I'm going to hang my hat in one place, and I actually, first of all, I don't wear hats, but secondly, you wouldn't want to hang it in one place. I would hang it on equality, not representation or diversity, but equality, because that's what we want. Those are both of those things are mechanisms for the thing that I want, which is freedom, and I can't have that unless I'm equal. So I think it's important to interrogate those words without fetishizing them, and that both diversity and representation to me are necessary and inadequate.
Thank you. I'm going to give you opportunity for a second question.
Could I?
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, because I mean, I follow you completely, also in terms of equality, but I also think maybe it's not even about inclusion to the table or being equal. I'm thinking of Sylvia Wynter's work, in which she's looking at the definition and the defining moment of what is human, and that we're always outside of that notion as black people. So do we want to become human if human means not seeing ourselves as human? So in that sense, it's, and I have to think of a friend of mine, Flavia Tsodon. She once shared a meme of a picture with the caption, it was a bear, you know, breaking a picnic table, and she was like, I don't want a seat at the table, I want to break the table, right? So are we thinking about being equal in a system that treats others still unequal, or are we thinking about abolishing and dismantling the whole system?
Well, yeah, because the metaphor of like, I want to see the table, I think, well, it depends what you're eating.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? Because I don't want to be, there's lots of tables I don't want any business with. And actually, that's actually quite important, particularly in moments like this summer, to be sufficiently discerning and to have sufficient self-respect in a way to say, actually, I don't want to come to that dance, that kind of, because there will be invitations in a period like this summer. The power institutions, they will reach out. They will say, will you come and talk to us about this? I want to have a meeting about that. And actually, the meetings that you refuse to go to are as important as the ones that you do, because they establish your price for kind of connection, to say to people, well, what are we going to talk about? And what is the function of this conversation? And all too often, and it's a recurring surprise and somehow I'm always surprised, somehow, at good people who know better, who end up in rooms where they've got no business, and they end up compromised in ways. And I'm all for negotiation, all for there will be settlements, there will be negotiation. I'm interested in engaging in the world as it is. But that actually means it's as important to walk away as it is to walk in. That there's power in both of those things. And all too often it's understood that if you don't go in the room, you're marginal, when actually you could be much more powerful outside the room than in it.
But when to say yes and when to say no? That's
Well,
a difficult
right, yeah,
question
and
sometimes.
that's kind of, and there's no science for that,
No.
you know, and sometimes I think it's obvious, and if you're saying no, if you're saying yes and only you are the beneficiary, then that's a good reason to say no, you know, but sometimes more, as often as not, it's obvious. Sometimes it's not, and there's a risk in doing both, but actually, for the most part, the dominant idea is that there is no risk in going. Actually, there is. And that there's no power in staying out, and there is both of those things.
All right. Now, time for your question.
Yeah, there have been a lot of questions on your personal family histories and Curacao in particular. And one that I chose, one of the questions, was from Jocelyn Ballantyne. It says, both of you have family roots in the Caribbean. I'd like to hear their views on whether/how the Caribbean is a marginalized region that doesn't count in the canon or the media, and how do personal stories and your family history tie into this?
As a region that doesn't count. I mean, Europe was created, was funded, was designed off of the back of the Caribbean. The scramble for the Caribbean was like the most important scramble in terms of geopolitical reconfiguration of Europe. There were no borders here in Europe, and then the Caribbean actually necessitated the creation of borders. So in that sense, what's happened since the decolonization movement is that the canon or the conversation here in Europe has found a way to dismiss the importance of the Caribbean and has found a way to marginalize it. But I think that also is because the decolonization movement happened with such a rush that a lot of the islands were still grappling with that trauma and didn't quite know how to work together, because there was a moment when the CARICOM could have become really important, and it just didn't come together at that time. But now you're seeing that the CARICOM is pushing for different types of relationships with the rest of Europe, a different type of solidarity between the islands, conversations are happening, and I think we're still dealing with a lot of colonial violence, of not being able to travel to each other freely and easily. On St. Martin, for example, we have the situation where if the two parts of the island, so the Dutch part and the French part, want to talk to each other, that happens in The Hague and Paris, right? It's bizarre that we still have these constructions going on. So I think a lot of these family histories and a lot of these conversations are leading towards a more deeper understanding and interrogation of the worlds and islands and island life that we would like to have. And so on St. Martin, there's a independence movement going on. There's a conversations happening to connect both sides of the islands and let go of Europe. But I think that also needs to go with reparations. And to quote a story told by me, or told to me, by Jean Casimir, the Haitian philosopher. I was at the decolonial summer school, and he was telling me about meeting Frank Martinez Arion, one of the great authors of Curaçao literature, and Dutch literature, actually, I should say. And they were at a conference in Suriname at the beginning of the 80s, and then Jean Casimir, he's from Haiti, and he asked Frank Martinez Arion, like, hey, when are you guys going to get, like, when are you going to fight for independence? And Frank Martinez Arion said, the moment they can return the island as they found it. And I mean, that's such a powerful statement. Also in terms of ecological destruction, slavery, indigenous knowledge is being destroyed. All these different types of histories need to be repaired. So how do we do that? And how do we push for those conversations? And right now, in the Netherlands at least, we're not seeing in the parliament or in the Senate conversations that could lead to this type of reckoning and this type of understanding of like how the Netherlands was built.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Historically, the Caribbean was central. It was front and center. You know, wars were fought there because there was sugar and tobacco, and I mean there was all this. You know, it was and geographically it was a kind of way station. So in between the Americas and Europe and Africa, it was it was right there, and so that's why it's actually so balkanized linguistically and nationally, which is one of the reasons, one of the things that kind of keeps it relatively weak is that the different bits of the Caribbean literally can't speak to each other. There's the example of St. Martin and the two bits of St. Martin, but the kind of, you know, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, the French-speaking Caribbean, the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean, Lusophone. So anyway, there are all of these kind of challenges which are logistical and linguistic and historical, which are because it has been central. And there is a weird thing now because of votes in the UN around Taiwan, where the Chinese are now very kind of key in there, and all sorts of kind of places with very British names, I don't know, Queen Margaret cricket stadium or whatever, and it's built by the Chinese. And the Chinese build them, and then they get a vote on the UN about not recognizing Taiwan, basically. Right. That's the deal. You then have to look at the kind of willful underdeveloping of their region. So Barbados was reduced to sugar. Just, you know, most islands were kind of reduced to single crop, to single crops, which then with industrialization, neoliberal globalization, the collapse of the Lomé, the provisions of the Lomé Agreement, which kind of sustained Caribbean, some Caribbean agriculture as a recognition of the colonial past, that faded away, which meant that countries like St. Lucia that were dependent on the banana trade or were kind of, you know, left high and dry. And that area that was once a trading post because of its geographical area for slaves and sugar and tobacco can then become a trading post for drugs and people and so on. I mean, it's still useful in a way, but it doesn't help. But then the other thing with regard to, I don't know if this is true for you or not, but that certainly for me, that being from Barbados forces a kind of cosmopolitanism on me. And that's not true for, I have uncles who kind of never left the island, or maybe once, you know, to Dominica or something. But that I have aunts and uncles in Canada, like many or most people from Barbados, Canada, Toronto specifically, London, Fort Lauderdale, and then I have a bunch of relatives who ended up in Texas, which is not actually where you're supposed to go. If you're from Barbados, you're supposed to go to Brooklyn. But And I think my grandfather, maybe, or great-grandfather, the men in the family were flaky and didn't stay and raise their kids, so it's very difficult to get their stories. But one of them worked on the Panama Canal, and so there has always been this coming and going.
Mm-hmm. So migration being part of
migration is part of your
experience,
existence, and which I consider a gift, really, because it has left me ambivalent to nation as an identity, and curious about what else there might be, where else there might be. I don't think it's an accident. And obviously lots of Caribbean people do lots of different subjects, but I studied languages and I studied to be an interpreter, and I do think that has something to do with a feeling of kind of geographical impermanence, and a kind of, it's not exactly a wanderlust, because people didn't kind of travel for fun. They traveled for mostly really low-paid work. But still, I feel like I'm from a kind of traveling people.
We don't have that much time left, so I wonder, are there any questions from the audience in this room? Yes, Marka.
Yeah, I have a question from a different angle. I'm thinking about, so one of the core projects in which you're engaged is the unearthing of the stories that are in front of us, whether that have been suppressed and erased and whitewashed. And then at the same time, there's people who are very, very attached to those, to things as they are and stories as they are. And they're so attached they're willing to be violent, right? So you saw that when Obama was elected, there was a rise in white militias and racist movements. It's been increasing. We've seen a militarization and a very strong militarized response also to the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a chance that in the process of us giving a place to those stories and making them part of our public memory and our community, our moral community, that it also generates a reaction, a backlash that's violent. And so I have, first of all, am I being too pessimistic? Second of all, if not, how do we engage that in the sense that, I mean, there's long histories of how to engage that kind of reactionary violence. And what's your thinking about it?
So let me repeat that for the online audience. I'm going to keep it very brief. So the core of your work, as you said, is also unearthing those alternative histories, right? Unearthing those stories that have been erased and repressed, and bring them into public memory. But that bringing into public memory also generates a backlash. And how do we engage with this reactionary backlash? Particularly the violence.
I think that's accurate. I think that, people invest an awful lot in these stories. And as we see with the Nazis defending Winston Churchill, they, even when they don't understand them, they're very keen on them. And I do think that there is a means, soft power, of marginalizing those people, which I do think makes the violence less attractive. And one good example for that would be Andrea Levy's Small Island. So sometimes the soft power of fiction, of kind of, Small Island, which is a story about Jamaican man who fights in the Second World War, and his experiences, and his wife, and the family that they live in, and that was a bestseller in England, Britain, and it introduced Britain to a story about Britain in a way that it could handle when it couldn't handle an awful lot of stories. They couldn't handle George Duckson or whatever, those kind of stories. And I guess when it comes to violence, I think two things really. For those, because they're, I guess going back, because that latent constituency that I talked about before, I think there's a lot more people who can be convinced, can be embraced than we give credit for, actually. And it's that they haven't been introduced, and they haven't been introduced in a way that they understand, and so on. And then there will be violent people. There will be people who won't stand for it. And I guess there are two things that I think about that. The first is that it's very important that we do marginalize them, and that they don't become the kind of arsenic in the water supply of our political culture. And that sometimes they have to be responded to violently, actually. Sometimes that violence has to be met with violence, which, if you think of how the state deals with terrorism, then nobody would think that that was a kind of awful thing to say, that you have people who are terrorists, and the notion that there would be a response to those people that would be violent. Actually, I'm not going to say that people are comfortable with it, but they understand it. Yeah, you're not going to be able to chat to someone who's just about to, put a plug on a vest. You're going to have to do something a bit more than that. And I don't see why that wouldn't also be true for the agents of white supremacy. I mean, it's not. George Floyd got killed, but the guy who shot all the people in the South Carolina church, somehow they managed to take him alive.
And get him a hamburger.
Sorry?
They also got him a hamburger.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, if he was hungry, then, And in a way, what I would like is the humanity that is shown to him to be shown to everybody. Actually, it would be better if he wasn't shot. But that, in the society in which we live, there is an understanding that there's a certain level of physical aggression that will be met with physical aggression. And I'm not sure why we would question that when it comes to white supremacists in a way. I'm not saying that you are, but that would be my response as to how we deal with them.
I think if I question it, it has more to do with a skepticism about the effectiveness of state violence, right? So if you think about Ruby Ridge and the ways in which that actually mobilized and continues to inspire white and right-wing militias. If you think the way in which the government bombs moved in Philadelphia, if you think about, there's dozens and dozens of examples of the ways in which the American state uses violence against its own citizens, white and black and different, and yellow. And that violence has been egregious and inhumane as opposed to something that sort of was, or think of Guantanamo Bay. I mean, what was it that the American state did to get control of terrorist violence, right? So,
Let me I will repeat it again for our online audience. So the question is, can we really tackle reactionary violence with state violence?
And I think, which is why, hence the first bit of the question, not alone, no, any more than you could suppress what they called Islamic terrorism, terrorism that was emerging from elements of a Muslim community, any more than you could suppress that alone with violence. That you have to understand where this violence is coming from, and then you have to kind of get to the source. But there's getting to the source, and there's dealing with the immediate kind of thing of a community being terrorized or a person being terrorized, and so on. And that, which is why it's important that they are marginalized, that they don't represent a kind of, that they don't actually represent a large number of people who in some way feel that this is feel that this is valid, because violence on its own, as terrorism actually illustrates, isn't particularly effective. violence on its own is not particularly effective, and that would be as true for the state as it would be for freelancers, if you like. But violence understood as part of politics, understood it's not social violence, these aren't people getting drunk and having a brawl, that it's the most extreme physical expression of a form of politics. And so one must have a form of politics to combat it with. And I guess what I'm trying to do is not be squeamish about the fact that that form of politics may also involve violence, but it can't only involve violence, because actually the violence that it's opposing isn't just about physical force. It actually represents something else. So you have to deal with the whole thing.
Quinsy, do you want to add to that? Somebody who has experienced reactionary violence a lot.
Yeah, several forms.
Several forms.
I think terrorism is about power, and violence is about power. So when thinking about so one of the things I keep thinking back on is that, so in 2011, 4 of us got arrested, as a couple of us were wearing these T-shirts with Zwarte Piet's racism on it, right? Pretty violent act by the state. And afterwards, they pulled their hands back and they said that the force was necessary because we could have become dangerous. And the notion of the could have become. And what I think is interesting is that after, so we got arrested, I think the year afterwards in Groningen, or the 2013 in Groningen, there was a demonstration, the parade for Sinterklaas, and the police actually had semi-automatic weapons on them and dressed as Zwarte Piet. Wow. Yeah. So this notion of violence or thinking about violence, it comes back to who exactly is about to be suppressed, or what exactly is about to be suppressed. And I think that the Ruby Ridge connection and the anti-establishment type of area doesn't necessarily apply to thinking about like Black Lives Matter and the violence that is encountered there, right? Because the Black Lives Matter, the type of violence that those protesters have been subjected to, from cars driving in on them, from people being doxxed online. In the Netherlands, there's a Twitter account that's posting personal information of people, harassing them at their jobs, and that's now being taken down by Twitter, who is now telling people that you can't wish, 45 COVID, right? All this type of stuff. And now, where am I going with this? I think for me, it's thinking through the ways in which white terror has not been seen as violence, right? It's always seen as fringe, but it's been co-constitutive of Europe, and it's been co-constitutive of the way in which we deal with each other here. It is inherently violent. The European Union, which got a Nobel Prize in 2012 for supposedly not making sure that war didn't break out in Europe anymore, it needs to hand back that prize because it is violent. There's nothing peaceful in the way how the borders are being policed. There's nothing peaceful about Frontex. There's nothing peaceful about the European borders being in the Indian Ocean or in the Caribbean. There's nothing peaceful in the ways in which I think it's Mali, there's also these peacekeeping missions going on and these asylum seeker centers being set up, or in Libya, a country destabilized and now literally a slave market is going on there. So in terms of thinking about violence and the reaction to it, yes, we're seeing this violence because of the gains that we've had, because of the soft power that we've used to marginalize these ideas, and that they're no longer seen as acceptable or as reputable positions to have. And also thinking through the ways in which violence is not just something that is physical in your face, but also beyond that. So we need to think about engaging the reactionary violence not just through our physical bodies, but also through what exactly is the state doing, and how exactly is the state being infiltrated by or still pushing for white supremacist violence. I mean, in Rotterdam, there's a research done where police officers were in a WhatsApp group together, sharing racist messages, and the mayor, who's a person of color, says, no, we shouldn't think about it anymore, we need to move forward. So even there, being in this position of power implicates you in this violent institution.
Holding the state accountable also for the violence. Exactly. It's time to conclude this evening. I want to read from one of your final columns for The Guardian. It's just one paragraph. One of your the title of one of your last columns for The Guardian is, "In these bleak times, imagine a world where you can thrive." And you wrote, "I sign off from this column at a dispiriting time. With racism, cynicism, and intolerance on the rise, wages stagnant, and faith that progressive change is possible declining even as resistance grows. Things look bleak. The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it." I want to conclude this first event, Black Lives Matter at Utrecht University. But of course, I would like to invite you to continue this conversation towards meaningful change. For example, by joining us for the second debate, and you can find the link below the YouTube video. The debate, it's a discussion on the responsibility of universities with respect to anti-racism. It's going to take place at late November, and then there's going to be a third event sometime in the winter. Before we leave, I want to extend my thanks to Candice Etbesi and Ella Shields, our chat moderators, the man behind the camera who helped us produce this live stream, media consultant Hans Schuurman. And of course, finally, I want to thank both of our speakers, Quinsy Gario and Gary Younge, two of the most prolific thinkers on anti-racism in Europe. Thank you for sharing the stage. Thank you for engaging with us, for challenging us, and for guiding us in reimagining anti-racist institutions while working towards a better world, which is in the mission statement of Utrecht University. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to Willemijn from Read My World. And thank you to Ebise and the whole Dipsaus crew.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.